Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. What investors can learn about forensic analysis from investigative journalism, hosted by the CFA Society of India. First, I'd like to take a moment to welcome all our audience who are joining us from around the world. I'm Ramesh Damani, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is scheduled for 2 hours, including Q&A. We'll leave time for Q&A after the presentation. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of your viewer and typing in your questions in the box. The webinar presentation will be available to viewers in the chat box. We value your feedback, so please complete the evaluation survey before you sign off today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Mark Twain, one of our guest's favorite authors, was fond of saying, if you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you are misinformed. Fake news, alternate facts, enemies of the people are all buzzwords used freely to describe the work of journalists today in the Trumpian era. Leaning against this ill wind of misinformation and trying to proffer not timely but timeless advice is our special guest, Jason Zweig. Currently, the investing and personal financial columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of the bestseller, The Devil's Financial Dictionary. He is also currently editor of Benjamin Graham's classic, The Intelligent Investor. Joining us all the way from New York, Jason Zweig. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Ramesh ji. And I would like to start by wishing everyone a very happy Diwali. I hope all your homes and lives are well lit despite the terrible times we seem to be going through right now. And may that light stay with you for the coming year and always. So I'm delighted to be with you. It's wonderful to be with CFA Society India. And I'm coming to you, of course, from a cold morning in New York. It's about 8 degrees here, but we like this kind of weather. It's bracing, it wakes us up. So I think this is a great time for me to get started, and I will share my screen, and then we will get going. So what I wanted to do is start by discussing a conversation I had with Warren Buffett in 2003. And I'm not the only person he has said this to, but what he told me was if I hadn't become an investor, I would have liked to be an investigative journalist. There's more to the story there's more to that story though. In fact, Warren was an investigative journalist. There's a famous story about Boys Town, which was I guess you would call it an orphanage based in Omaha that had become badly mismanaged, both financially and operationally. And he was the first to figure out what was going on at the same time as the Omaha Sun was investigating it. And Warren not only helped from the sidelines, but he did several critical interviews with confidential sources. He reviewed the financial accounts with the reporters, and I believe he also helped with the writing and editing of the series of articles that ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize as one of the most important investigations the US media did in the early 1970s. So what the lesson I think every financial analyst should draw from this is that there are a lot of parallels between financial analysis and investigative journalism, and Warren himself is living proof of that, not just the overlap in his interest and the similar skill set that's required, as we're about to talk about, but also the fact that he himself became an investigative journalist for a time and by all accounts was quite good at it. So what does it take? What does it take to do good investigative journalism? Probably the same 6 basic skills that are required to be a good financial analyst. It's curiosity, attention to detail, persistence, skepticism, fairness, and toughness. And I have a little essay about these things on my personal website. You don't need to copy down the links in my presentation because we'll be sharing the slides with you later. All you'll have to do is email the society. Let's talk about curiosity for a minute. So it's love of learning for its own sake. And to put it in more technical terms, it's the desire for information in the absence of extrinsic or external reward. If you're curious, you love learning for its own sake. You're not interested in learning for some kind of special payoff. You're doing it because you love it and because you want to improve yourself. It can be cultivated, though. It is possible to become better at being curious. So the first step is to make it safe for yourself to express that curiosity. Your boss, your spouse or your family, your friends, all make demands on your time and your energy, and also can be quite judgmental because curiosity looks very much like procrastination. Curiosity seems to other people to be a form of wasting time. And if you don't look busy all the time at your job, it may look as if you are shirking, as if you're being idle or lazy. And because for all those reasons, I'm a big fan of being curious when no one else is around. At 5 a.m, for example, or maybe when you're having lunch in a quiet place by yourself, or after all the children have gone to sleep, at a time and a place when no one can see what you're doing and second guess you and make you feel guilty for expressing an interest that doesn't seem to have an immediate result. So as you pursue your curiosity, you should look for disagreement or controversy, something that is still in contention. And when you find it, you then should pose that as a question to yourself. How should I resolve this matter that other people still feel is in dispute? And that's a mental exercise that will keep you engaged and ensure that you continue to learn. As you go, you should make predictions about what you'll find and what conclusions you'll be able to draw from that evidence. And also, it's very important to keep track of what surprises you along the way. And those two go hand in hand, of course, because as your predictions are either confirmed or refuted, you will be surprised or not. And you can also make a very simple schematic map: what I know, what I want to know, what I learned. And there's a wonderful article that I've linked to that helps put all this on a little bit of scientific footing for those who are curious. So another very important attribute in curiosity is to have and maintain beginner's mind. And I don't think I need to lecture an audience in India about beginner's mind. I think it's a state of mind that's very familiar to people in India that unfortunately many people in the West no longer emphasize. And we can see that, for example, in the attitude of many public leaders in the West who take the position constantly that they already know the answers, or they know more than the experts, or their experience is all they need to guide them as they make very important decisions, which I think is a not very constructive approach. So what does beginner's mind consist of? Of course, it means that you have an open mind, you're eager to learn. You can cast aside your preconceptions or your prior understanding. And most importantly, that you can continue to do that the more you learn, and that you never lose that ability to regard yourself as ignorant and only at the beginning of the journey of learning. And one of the best expressions I know of this was made by the great Japanese artist Hokusai. And he said until he was 70 years old, none of his work was any good, which I love. So one trick I use in my own work is that when I'm not working, I read nothing about finance or investing. In fact, when I watch movies, I don't even watch financial movies. I've only seen 2 movies about investing or the stock market. I saw Wall Street and I saw The Big Short. And in both cases, it was because I knew people who were involved in the movie, or knew people who were involved in the story. And I do this for a reason. When I'm not working, I want my mind to recharge. So I will read science books, I will read biographies, I will read history books, I'll read poetry, and I'll read fiction. But I never read books about finance except for my day job. I always want my mind in my downtime from work to be engaged in other areas so that I have a broad set of references that I can bring to bear when I go back to work. I'm also a big believer in what I call structured serendipity, and I've written about this in the past. This involves studying things that appear to have nothing to do with my job as an investing columnist or an investigative journalist. I might read a scientific article about the cooperative behavior of fish. I might read an article about evolutionary psychology. I spend a lot of time reading scientific journals, most of which have nothing explicit to do with finance or investing. And my goal is to keep my mind open to the possibility of getting new ideas from new fields that I can apply to the problems I'm trying to solve in my work. And I think that's hugely important. And ultimately, curiosity turns into observation. If you train yourself to be curious, then you're never off duty. When the coronavirus epidemic finally ends and we can all go back to visiting people in their offices, I've always been able, as a reporter, to find things with my senses that I might not necessarily have been able to find with my research skills. So when you visit a company's offices, you should be on red alert. All your senses should be fully aware. What do you smell? What do you see? What do you hear? If you're in an office or a headquarters, a home office that has a kitchen or a pantry, is it clean? What do the washrooms look like? What does the factory floor look like? If you're highly suspicious and you really think something may be going wrong at the company, you have more ability than you may realize to linger on premises. I don't know exactly how it works in India, but in the US, typically a visitor to a company will be escorted most of the time. But rarely will people escort you into the washroom or out of it, or stay in there with you while you're using it. And every once in a while, you can make incredible discoveries by being where you aren't supposed to be. And many years ago, I was in the washroom quite innocently. I actually needed to use the facilities. But while I was in there, the CEO came in without realizing that I was the person using the toilet. And he was speaking with one of his colleagues and reminiscing about a time when he was driving his sports car far in excess of the speed limit. And he was of German origin, and he was telling his colleague that when the policeman pulled him over to give him a ticket for speeding, he pretended not to be able to speak English and got away without paying the ticket. And he laughed uproariously at this and was very proud of the fact that he had lied to the policeman and gotten away with speeding. It was something like 120 miles an hour. And what is that, 150 or 60 kilometers per mile per hour. And then he left, of course. And obviously that led me to realize that my suspicions were valid and there was probably a lot more to say about this company. So obviously you should never trespass, you should never break rules, but you may have more flexibility than you realize. And there is a lot you can pick up about a company and management if you rely on your eyes and ears and you're resourceful. So attention to detail is critical. And it's vital in financial analysis and in investigative journalism. So essentially, all it is recognizing patterns. And Herbert Simon, the psychologist and polymath who won the Nobel Prize in economics many years ago, pointed out that intuition really is nothing but recognizing patterns, and it comes from practice. Chess players have enormous intuition. Firefighters have very powerful intuition. People who do something repetitively, attentively, when the consequences are extremely important and the decision-making environment is regular, can develop very accurate intuitions. So it's important to be conscious as you practice that you want to structure a regular decision-making environment. And for an analyst, for example, that not only would mean reading hundreds of financial statements, looking at the accounts of countless companies, but you also want to try to read them all the same way. You want to have a systematic approach so that whenever something is out of order, it will jump out at you. And this is what psychologists call oddball detection. If you become accustomed to viewing patterns in an identical process over and over and over again, then the slightest variation in the pattern will jump out at you. And what research has shown is that negative stimuli can be detected much faster than positive stimuli, which is very good news for a financial analyst or an investigative journalist. And that's especially true when the surrounding stimuli are neutral, which is ideal for you and for me in my day job. And here's a very simple illustration of that. This is schematic faces that were presented to people in psychological experiments. And you can quickly pick up the one face in each crowd that is different. As you notice, the smiling face is somewhat more difficult to pick up among the unhappy faces than vice versa. So it's easier to spot bad news than good news, which itself is very good news. So I want to give you a very simple example of just how tiny an oddball can be in order for you to detect it. So in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service, our taxation authority, requires nonprofits, charities, to file a form called Form 990, which is essentially an annual report. It's their financial accounts. They have to file it annually. And there's an exhibit in each Form 990 of the largest recipients of payments. So the most important vendors or suppliers to the nonprofit, the people who each year were paid the most by the nonprofit. And I believe these disclosures were required actually as a result of Warren Buffett's investigation of Boys Town. That hadn't occurred to me until just now. It's a requirement that came in the 1970s, I believe. So I found an asterisk where there shouldn't have been one. And yes, I am literally referring to an asterisk. And here it is. So this is a nonprofit that I was curious about because someone had mentioned it to me in an ambiguous way. It was a good source of mine who said, I wonder if something's going on there. And that was all the person had to say. And so I looked at this payment table in its accounts, and in the compensation column, where in every other situation I had ever looked at, there were always numbers, suddenly there was an asterisk. And I said, why would anyone put an asterisk here? And then I read the footnote, and it said compensation for these services is based on required labor needs and a calculation necessary to fulfill those needs. And I said, what does that mean? That sounds as if we pay these people whatever they feel like or whatever we feel like or both. And then I noticed that the address for this independent contractor, as the language says, was identical to the address for the nonprofit I was looking at. And many months later, that resulted in a story on page 1 of the Wall Street Journal about very troubling conflicts of interest that indeed indicated that the nonprofit was making payments to companies affiliated with its founder. So attention to detail, as you can see, means taking nothing for granted. And here's another very powerful example. So A few years ago, I ended up investigating a fund manager who worked for BlackRock, which of course is a great firm, and I have nothing against BlackRock whatsoever. But in the end, our SEC, our securities regulator, imposed a $12 million fine as a result of the problems that were highlighted in these articles. And where did they come from? Well, I know how to spell the name Daniel. I know it's spelled Daniel, and I know how to spell the surname or the word Rice. It's spelled Rice. But when I fact check anything I write, when I do my final verification before we print, I always double check every proper noun, everything that's capitalized, and every number, every fact, everything that could objectively contain an error. And so I wanted to check, how do you spell Daniel and how do you spell Rice? And unfortunately, the media relations person at BlackRock didn't immediately answer the phone. So instead, I did what most people would do, I suppose. I Googled it, and about 5 or 6 hits down the Google page was a website called Rice Energy. And I clicked on it and I found this and I said, oh, there he is. Daniel, Daniel, Rice, Rice. And I had my fact check and I moved on. And I finished my article and I sent it to my editor, and I got up and walked around the office, and I came back and I said, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Why is Daniel Rice, a portfolio manager for BlackRock, who runs an energy fund, owning and founding an energy company? And this led to an extraordinary series of articles and columns that for me were among the most revelatory I've ever done, revelatory to me, because I learned just how many times a story can change and how complicated it can be to get to the bottom of conflicts of interest. So the series began with BlackRock saying, there's nothing wrong. This isn't a conflict of interest. And we have nothing further to say on the matter. Then I learned that Mr. Rice's mutual fund had put roughly 9% of its assets in a publicly traded company that had done a joint venture with the company that he was running for his personal family accounts. And then BlackRock's response became, there may be a conflict of interest, but we have mitigated it. And it didn't need to be disclosed because it was mitigated. And then I came up with additional evidence that the conflicts could present a problem. And then BlackRock's response became, it may be a conflict, but it has been mitigated and we're going to go ahead and disclose it. And as I learned more and more, the story eventually changed to, well, it is a conflict. We need to disclose it. And then ultimately it became Mr. Rice is leaving the firm. And then a couple of years later, the SEC imposed a $12 million penalty. So stories change as you learn more. And as companies evolve their response to the evidence. But as always, attention to detail is critical. And if you're doing a report, particularly on a company where you may have negative information and where you may suspect that management are engaging in inappropriate practices, then your accuracy will determine your credibility. It will not matter if everything you believe about the company turns out to be true if you make a single error in your write-up or presentation. If anything, if any detail, no matter how small, turns out to be inaccurate, the company will attempt to invalidate every single thing you say. So it's vital to be utterly accurate, completely accurate. And at the Journal, we call this bulletproofing. We want every article we write to be bulletproof. Nothing can penetrate it. And that's always our goal. And I can tell you, to my great regret, that not everything I've written is error-free. I have made mistakes. We always correct them. And that the only protection against making errors is scrupulous fact-checking. And I believe this is one area where good investigative journalism is superior to good financial analysis, because investigative journalists are trained down to our bones to do everything we possibly can to make sure what we write is 100% accurate, because the consequences for making a mistake are so high. So we take nothing for granted. And one trick I often use is if I've written an article that is likely to be controversial or attacked by the people I've written it about, I will change the font. I'll put it in these strange shapes and colors, or I'll actually fact check it in reverse. I'll read what I've written from bottom to top and go through it sentence by sentence backwards, because that will help me spot any potential error. In a few cases where I've been particularly concerned that we might be sued for libel because the assertions we were making were so strong and the misconduct we had identified was potentially so severe, I'll actually copy and paste the entire article into Excel and randomize the sentence order so that I fact check each sentence separately, completely divorced from the natural order it will appear in the published article, so that I can view everything as if I've never seen it before. That's really the goal. So persistence is hugely important. And that's because when you investigate a company or a person, you'll go wrong so many times. And it's easy to despair and to think you should give up. So I have a few motivating tricks that I use. First of all, and I know I don't have to tell an Indian audience about the importance of this, you should always be polite. Politeness is a form of self-discipline. When I get frustrated, I have the natural, universal human tendency to become abrupt and sharp when I'm frustrated. So I impose the discipline of politeness on myself as I encounter obstacles along the way. When I get frustrated, I say please and thank you much more than I usually would. And it turns out that that is a very effective tool for enabling you to keep going and for getting additional information out of people. You have to be patient, because the process of investigating potential misconduct can take months, it can take years. Don't give up. And the caveat here, of course, is that if you encounter obstacles, they can come in two forms. One is that a person or a company you're writing about who is engaging in wrongdoing will make it as difficult as possible for you to learn anything. That's the kind of obstacles you should regard as temporary and you should not be discouraged by. There is another kind of obstacle, which is that you're just plain wrong and you don't want to be stubborn in the pursuit of something that isn't there. But if it is there, then you should never give up. And as the corollary to the importance of politeness, I'm an enormous believer that whenever you're on premises at a company or a person's house, you should always learn the names and connect with all the people all the way down the support staff chain, so that the person who answers the door, the person who works the elevator, the maid, the butler, and the executive assistant, anyone who comes in contact with the boss is someone you should address by name, you should introduce yourself to. You have no idea when those people may someday be willing to reach out to you and share a secret with you. And you have business cards in your pocket or your purse, and that's what they're there for. And one thing I've learned is when you give a business card to someone who's very low down in the command structure, when you give a business card to a butler or a doorman or a cook or a maid, they're thrilled. They will treasure your business card. And it's always possible that if they see something wrong, they may contact you when no one else might. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it can be an enormous breakthrough in a project. So one of my former Wall Street Journal colleagues spent the better part of a year trying to get a single person to talk to him. He had seen an obscure post in an online chat area where almost no one ever visited that struck him as very unusual and intriguing and suggestive. And he tried and tried and tried and failed and failed and tried, and eventually figured out who this person was, tracked him down, and the person would not speak to him. But eventually he cracked the source and got the source to agree to talk. And then the company started tailing both of them, spying on them. And my colleague got to the point where everywhere he went, someone was following him, either in a car or on foot. But he didn't give up, and it paid off. And most of you, I'm sure, know this story about Theranos, the Silicon Valley blood testing company that turned out to be a complete fraud. And it resulted in John's wonderful book, Bad Blood, which I hope many or all of you have read, which is fabulous. But it took the better part of a year before John was able to make the breakthrough that led to the story. One of my favorite journalists is a writer for the Miami Herald named Edna Buchanan. And in an article in the New Yorker some years ago, the wonderful writer Calvin Trillin told this story about her, which I'll paraphrase. Essentially, what Edna Buchanan does is she's the crime reporter for the Miami Herald. She writes about murders primarily. And a large part of her job is calling the household of someone who has just been murdered, shot to death typically. And she asks to speak to the person's spouse or children. And almost always, understandably, they hang up on her. And I think what most of us would do if they had to do that situation once is, if someone hangs up on you, you give up. But what Edna Buchanan does is she counts to 60 and she picks up the phone and calls right back. And as she points out, by persisting, by trying again, you can get people to talk. And that's really the key, is not to give up. And you always call again and again. If no one answers, you always leave a voicemail. What I tend to do in an investigative project is I write those voicemails out before I make the call. So I write down, what am I going to say? And then I just read it in a natural voice. So this happened to me earlier this year in a way I'll never forget. I was trying to reach somebody who was being sued by a fund in the US for fraud. And I had the complaint, the lawsuit against the person. I knew what the litigation said, but I wanted to make it very clear to the person that I didn't have his side of the story. And my belief was that by emphasizing the fact that I wanted to give him the ability to tell his side of the story, that eventually he would talk. And I called 5 times and I never heard back from him. And every time I used a variation of the same language. And eventually he called me back. And it resulted in this story. And no, I don't have a vendetta against BlackRock. This is purely a coincidence. But it was one of the most extraordinary stories I've ever worked on. It turned out that the manager of this BlackRock fund had invested roughly $70 million in a privately traded security, largely because the manager of that company that BlackRock invested in had put the fund manager's daughter in a movie. And I never would have found that out if I hadn't called again and again. Now, what do you do when people won't talk to you? You don't let them hang up the phone immediately. You always try to get something out of them before they give up on you. And typically, you want to get someone else they know who would be willing to talk. And of course, you say, I would never tell the person I got their name from you, but can you think of anybody else who might be able to help me? Or documents. Where could I find them? Who has the documents? And finally, Signal can be a very powerful tool. I'm sure many of you use Signal. It's an end-to-end encrypted telephone and communications app that we find very helpful at the Journal. People who use it trust that anything they communicate on Signal is confidential and can't be tapped into by third parties. So actually, let me stop for a moment and see if we have any questions that might be worth delving into before we go on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jason. You've often heard about the 7 habits of effective people. We're now learning the 6 habits of great analysts and editors. So thank you for that. A couple of questions have started coming in. So one question is coming from Lavish Vashisht. He says, what advice would you give someone working in a country where powerful interests can not only scuttle investigative work, but can even cause personal injury?
Yeah, so this is a question I thought would come up And let me just take this one, and then we'll move on, and we'll take the other questions at the end, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So hang on just one second. Let me take this off screen share for a moment. Okay. So I think this is a difficult question for me. I don't want to presume to advise a local audience in detail. You know, in the US, we're quite fortunate. Our libel laws give us a lot of protection. I think much more protection than people in Commonwealth or former Commonwealth countries tend to have. I think I would give you two general suggestions. The first is to proceed very deliberately. Many of us like to make a map, and what we will do is we will draw concentric circles. So the circle at the heart of the map is the company itself, or the person himself or herself we're investigating. Then there's a second circle outside that, which is everyone close to the company or the person. That would be current employees, close friends and family. Then there's an outer circle, which would be former employees, maybe alienated former friends and family, experienced students of the company, people who know a lot about the person in question. And all of those things help map your approach. You want to start in the outer circle, and you want to minimize the chances that the person at the heart, or the company at the heart of your investigation, will find out about it early enough to stop you before you learn anything that is definitive. And mapping it that way can be very helpful. And you always want to be asking yourself, is this person in the outer circle or in one of the inner circles? And if you cross those lines too early, then word can make it back to the person or the company in time for them to quash your investigation. As far as safety is concerned, I think the best advice I can give you is simply to be incredibly thorough and to be as precise and careful and accurate as possible. And also, don't be inflammatory. And we'll come to this later in the section on fairness, which I think will help shed a little more light on it. But in your initial inquiries, you want to make sure that you don't ask leading questions. When you're speaking to people in the outer circle, if you jump too quickly from how long have you known so-and-so to did you ever see so-and-so do anything wrong, the person will immediately suspect that you're looking for negative information. And one of the techniques that investigative journalists do is we just talk to people. And again, I'll mention this more a bit later in the talk. Don't jump immediately to the critical questions. Time is your ally. You should be able to use as much time as necessary to uncover the information that you're seeking. And that also is critical. As far as protecting yourself physically, I think you just have to trust in the quality of your information, and then use whatever resources you have available at your firm or otherwise at your disposal to keep yourself safe. I realize it can be dangerous. So let's go back to sharing the slides. Excuse me, I'll grab them here. Okay. So our philosophy is that we shouldn't be pro-cyclical, we should be counter-cyclical. We're trying to take the other side of regression to the mean. And the very motto of journalism, at least in America, and I think in many other countries, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And in a way, that is a wonderful expression of what regression to the mean signifies. And it's another way of saying what goes up must go down, or the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So the 7th biggest company in America can be a fraud. The hottest startup in Silicon Valley can be a fraud. And I know many of you are familiar with Indian examples. I won't go into these in detail because you know much more about them than I do, but I give my thanks to Srinivas and to Nimisha, whom I hope to meet someday. So what do you do with skepticism? So once you suspect that something is wrong, you reach out to people in, as I said, the outer circle. And typically for companies, that'll be competitors and customers. And I learned very early in my career, some 30 years ago, the first inkling I ever had that a company was a fraud came when I was speaking with a competitor. And I, at that point, had no idea that the company might have been doing anything wrong. And the CEO of its largest competitor said to me, well, you know, we bid on the same contract that they bid on. And everyone in our industry has the same cost structure. And I know that for a fact. And they underbid us by 15%. And I know that they would lose money on that contract because I know how much margin was in it. And I'm going to say that was 32 years ago. And I still remember the number 15%. So what you want to do is you want to ask about the same general factors that you would scrutinize when you're reading the accounts. You want to ask about their accounting treatment, their inventory practices, how they bid on contracts. And a simple technique is, if you use LinkedIn, as I know a lot of people in India do, you want to use the former not current function to see if you can identify people who used to work there. Now, I would caution you that the hit rate, the likelihood that you'll find people who will talk to you is very low. This, for me, as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, probably works less than 10% of the time. But the good news is when it does work, it tends to work very well. When you finally do find someone willing to speak with you, you're likely to learn a lot. Many of you are already doing this, but you can use OCR or other textual analysis software to track changes in financial statements, especially focusing on the accounting treatment. Any changes, alterations the company has made to how it reports its accounts. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can partner with a good reporter. And I would highly recommend the New Delhi or Mumbai bureaus of the Wall Street Journal if you're interested. So now I want to talk about fairness, which is vital. So the question earlier was about safety. And I think fairness helps a lot on that front. If people perceive that you're on a crusade against them, that you're desperate to learn anything negative, they will turn negative. So our rule at the Wall Street Journal, and it's not a rule, it's our way of life, is that we never, ever, ever will lie or mislead or deceive anyone for any reason. We're always completely truthful in how we go about our work. We don't impersonate other people. We don't make anything up. But this is critical. Certainly in our courts and perhaps in yours, when someone takes the oath before testifying, we say that we will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And when we report and when we investigate, we do tell the truth, and we tell nothing but the truth. But you don't have to tell the whole truth at the beginning. If I have negative information about a company or a person, I'm not obligated under our code of conduct to tell the person or the company every single negative thing I know at the beginning. Eventually, I must. But when I make my initial approach, when I'm trying to get the company or the person to speak with me, I can indicate that I have some negative information, but I don't have to itemize it. Because if I do that, I'll scare them off. And we call this telegraphing. What I want to do is I want the company to realize that I'm serious and that it is in their best interest to be open with me. But I don't want them to shut down and refuse to speak with me. So what I do is I phrase my questions or my line of inquiry in a way that's general enough so that I don't scare them, but specific enough so they realize I know something. So for example, if I suspected insider trading, I would never say, I believe that your CEO or your chief financial officer has been illegally trading the stock. I would not say that at the outset. But I might phrase it in an abstract, general way that lets them know that's one of the things I'll be asking about when we get to meet in person. Now, often when a company senses that you have information about them it wishes you didn't have, they will respond by saying, give us a list of specific questions. That's something we try to avoid as long as possible. Sometimes it's the only way the company will communicate. And in that case, ultimately, yes, I will provide that, but that's a last resort. We always try to avoid that or defer it for as long as possible. So this is the key language. This is the kind of thing we say all the time, which is, I'm giving you the chance to tell your side of the story, because all the other information I have is from other people's perspectives. And I want to hear from you, the person, or you, the company, in order to make sure that what I present is fair. And also, I have to be willing at every step of the process to abandon my project because it turns out I'm wrong. I don't want to fall prey to confirmation bias and just dig in, presenting only negative information and ignoring anything positive or disconfirmatory of my hypothesis. The journal has a very strict rule that any negative information has to be attributed. And what that means is we would say, according to financial documents reviewed by the Wall Street Journal, or according to a professor of accounting, according to the company's financial accounts, according to a former employee. It's always attributed. It's never stated as a fact without explaining to the readers where it comes from and why we give it credence. And I describe that as simply saying how I know what I know. And that helps protect me. Another critical factor in fairness, and I believe also in safety, is watch your tone. Don't be accusatory. Don't sound like a prosecutor. Don't sound like a litigator. Do not accuse, simply state. One of my personal rules is I don't use adverbs when I write an investigative article. I don't say very, I don't say significantly. I don't say extremely. I use almost no word that ends with ly, because all of those words are intensifiers, and I want the evidence to speak for itself. If the evidence doesn't speak for itself, your language can't speak for it. And then finally, and most importantly, the journal has what we call the no surprises rule, which is if I'm writing about you and I'm saying something negative, critical, potentially harmful to you as a business or a person, you must know before we publish it everything that I'm saying about you. And that involves going through the article point by point, typically over the telephone, and giving the other person the opportunity to refute or deny or comment on each specific point. So all of this requires toughness. You need a thick skin. I mean, here's a set of typical things that we hear in the course of our work. People tend to become very defensive and hostile, often angry. Often they will personalize. They will say, you're a liar. You're full of various things that the human body excretes. You're an anatomical part I won't name in a discussion like this. It goes on and on and on. People can become very abusive. And of course, one of the critical markers indicating that you're on the right track is that people become defensive. Someone who has done nothing wrong will never be angry at somebody who's asking questions because they just seem far-fetched. An honest person, an honest company would just simply laugh very mildly and politely at the idea that he or it is doing something wrong. As any of us know, being accused without credibility is not threatening, but being accused when the evidence indicates that it is correct is extremely threatening to people. So that anger is a sign you're on the right track, but it also can be very difficult to deal with. So this is the key. My response to everything people throw at me is I say the same thing over and over again in multiple ways, but it's always very similar wording. I'm just trying to make sure that what I write is accurate and fair. I don't use the word truth. I have heard other reporters say, I'm just trying to figure out what the truth is, or I'm just trying to get at the truth. I don't like saying that because when you use the word truth, the person at the other end immediately infers that you're accusing them of lying, which of course may be the case, but it doesn't make your job easier to say to the person's face, you're a liar. So I just emphasize accuracy and fairness. And I've never had a situation where after an article of mine came out, somebody said, oh, I'm really sorry I talked to you. People always say, I'm glad I did talk to you because that made your story reflect my side of the issues. And that's what I will tell people who are reluctant to speak with me. I'll say, would you prefer that I do this project without your input, or would you rather be able to influence the outcome? So ultimately, you need to be tough because if you've done a good job, if your analysis is correct, somebody is going to be angry at you. And that goes with the territory. I always know if I write an investigative story and nobody's angry at me when I'm done, I didn't do it right. It should make somebody angry, and I have to accept the consequences. So after the article comes out, if I happen to see anyone connected with it, the CEO, or anybody else at the company, or maybe it was just a profile of an individual person. If I'm at an event and I see anyone connected with it, I always make a special point of going straight up to the person and asking them how they are, smiling, shaking their hand and saying hello. I want to make it very clear to them, I'm not afraid of them. And I have no reason to be afraid of them. So just a very quick ending few notes here. So how do you get people to tell you what they aren't supposed to tell you? Well, first, always do your homework. It's tempting early in a project just to pick up the phone and reach out to somebody almost on a whim to get started. But you have to do your homework first. And my rule, which I developed over 30 years ago, is you only get one chance. So at the very least, when early in your preparation, you should always have one question in your, literally in your pocket. And I learned this from the great Hollywood comedian Mel Brooks. Some 30 years ago, I was working on a project about the role of Hollywood in the financial industry and American public life. And I was calling various celebrities in Hollywood. I was calling their offices to arrange appointments to speak with them. And I called Mel Brooks's office, and the person answers, and I said, I'd like to make an appointment to speak with Mel Brooks. And the person at the other end said, what do you want? And I said, well, I want to get on his calendar. And he said, you're on his calendar. This is Mel Brooks. What do you want? And I was so flabbergasted because he was one of my heroes as a teenager that I could not think of anything to ask him. And I just stuttered and stammered for several minutes. And finally he said, well, kid, I do have a tip for you. I will tell you something you need to know. Always have one question ready before you call somebody. And then he hung up on me. So it's very important to be organized. And when you're interviewing someone, if the person says something, you should be prepared. You should know from the sound of it that it isn't right. You should be able to say, you know, on page 72 of the annual report, I thought it said your net working capital is 432 million. And you just told me it was 978. So the more homework you do, the more prepared you are, the better off you'll be. The other thing is you control the time when you're investigating someone. You should be able to take as much time as you need, and it's up to them to tell you when you're taking too much time. So invest in the people you're interviewing, because you'll be interviewing people from all walks of life. Give them the opportunity to get to like you as they learn more about you, as they spend more time talking with you. They'll feel more comfortable sharing. And even though you may be in pursuit of negative information, it's fine to be nice. You don't have to pretend to be the devil with a pitchfork just because you're digging. You want to get documents all the time. Every contact you have with a person, you should be asking, what documents could I read that would verify what we're talking about? Another very simple trick, and I think this may go against the way a lot of financial analysts are trained, at least in the trainings I've been involved in. I always read financial statements backwards. I start at the end. I always read the footnotes long before I read the balance sheet or the income statement. And I'll read the letter to the shareholders from the chairman absolutely last, if at all. And then this is extremely important. You want to encourage people to do as much of the talking as possible. The more they talk, the more you will learn. And that may seem a little paradoxical given all the talking I've been doing for the past hour, but you never should fill the silence. Often people who have negative information will be very hesitant to share it. If they know that a CEO has been stealing or lying or cheating, if they know that the company is fabricating its financial accounts, they'll be hesitant to just come right out and say that. And often when you ask a question and there's a long pause, the temptation you have is to fill the silence and to say something like, well, moving right along, maybe I could ask you about X, Y, and Z. Instead, just let the silence build, because other people will fill it for you. And often they'll fill it with information. And in the story that I shared a few minutes ago of the BlackRock fund that invested in Hollywood, I had asked this man who was being sued, why would such a fund invest so much money, almost 10% of its assets, in your little obscure movie making company? And he gave me a long answer, and then he paused for the longest time, a very long pause. And then he said, well, you know, I did put the portfolio manager's daughter in one of my movies. And if I had not let him pause and fill the silence, I never would have learned that, because he was not prepared to tell me that voluntarily. So we've talked about this before, and these are the last tips. Whenever you're investigating a company or a person, there's always one question that is key. There's the one question that you must know the answer to, that matters more than anything else. And you should take that question and bury it. You never ask it first, and you never ask it last. Put it 2/3 of the way through. And that's a way to encourage the people you're asking to let their guard down a little bit. You want them to be a little bit surprised by that question. And then finally, you should always end any conversation with anybody by saying, is there anything else I didn't ask you that you would like me to know? Anything you want to share that presents another point of view or gives me information that you think I should have. So I want to thank you, and we'll jump to questions. I'll put this slide up for a minute. Again, all these links are in the presentation, which the Society will share. But thank you very much, and I think we have time for a few questions.
Thank you, Zweig. Right on time. Your presentation has finished, and what an enlightening presentation. Thank you so much. It's just been wonderful.
Great.
Jason, let me ask you a softball question to start with. Not the real question I want to ask you. So I'm going to ask that in the middle. So I'll ask you a softball question. If you had to rerun or rewatch two movies, All the President's Men and The Big Short, which one would you do?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, I assume you're asking for this in this context, right?
I'm just asking, I mean, in terms of being a journalist or being in the markets, what?
Yeah. Well, I think if you want to learn better how to investigate, yes, I would suggest All the President's Men, although I also would encourage you to read both books. Both books are wonderful. And one of the striking things about The Big Short as a book that I'm not sure comes through quite as well in the movie is the strong sense in which each of the people who saw through the, what should we say, who saw through the falsehoods of the housing boom, at least in the United States, one of the common attributes they all shared is they all were very iconoclastic thinkers. Some of them almost appeared to be autistic or to have Asperger's syndrome. They all were differential thinkers. And they had the ability to step outside what everyone else perceived to be an unassailable truth and to question it. And they had a profound skepticism that was very difficult to maintain at that time. I will say outright that I was not nearly skeptical enough about the housing boom in the United States. Although I was very skeptical about the internet bubble in 1999 and 2000, I was mostly taken by surprise by the bursting of the housing bubble in 2007 and 2008. So that's probably because I wasn't paying close attention to it, but I'm not sure I would have been able to identify it if I had been, because I might not have been skeptical enough.
Great. Jason, have you ever watched the US serial Columbo?
Yes, but not in many years.
Yeah, but Peter Falk would always ask the question, the most important question at the last minute, almost as he's stepping out of the door. And our advice is here to the middle, but that's just kind of fun.
Well, yes, and let me make a note about that, Ramesh Ji, if I may. So I think that the difference is environmental. As a journalist, and for that matter, as a financial analyst, particularly when you're on premises, when you are in someone's office, you're probably there for a finite period of time. They've probably blocked out whatever it might be, an hour and a half, 30 minutes. But you're in a window on that person's calendar. And they might be able to go over, they might be able to speak with you for longer than you're on the schedule for. But ultimately, they can throw you out anytime they want. And the danger you run if you leave the most important question to the very end is that you may run out of time to ask it.
Right. Fair enough. It was just in a lighter moment.
Yes.
Jason, as you well know, markets move between greed and fear. In March 2020, it was fearful. At what position are we right now?
We are more toward greed, I think. Obviously, I can't speak to the market in India, but in the U.S., there certainly are some troubling signs. But I think the greed is compartmentalized. I don't think it extends across the market as a whole. In fact, my next column will talk about this topic, so I can't give too much detail, but it seems to be confined to particular sectors. And of course, large technology companies would be the obvious example. But most stocks in the US are not priced wildly above historical norms. And as everyone on this call surely knows, value investing has been out of style for many, many years. And numerous companies around the world remain reasonably priced. So on the greed-fear spectrum, we're closer to greed than fear, and we're probably closer than we should be. But I don't think the danger of a sort of widespread panic is imminent. And I certainly hope I'm right about that.
Yeah, not with the yield being so high still at about 3% dividend yield.
Yes.
In one column, you made this a statement which I find very profound, and because I believe in it too. You wrote that all bull markets end badly. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, that's what history shows. And I think it's because of the inevitable feedback loop. You know, in a bull market, as Danny Kahneman said to me once, I believe I'm remembering this almost verbatim, in a bull market, so many of your mistakes will pay off that you won't be able to realize their mistakes. And, you know, the famous cliche, a rising tide lifts all boats, is really true. So if almost everything you do goes up, then eventually you'll just do anything. And increasingly, as bull markets persist, that's exactly what investors end up doing. They begin by buying quality and they end up buying garbage. And there's a wonderful old saying that, you know, cream rises to the top, but in bull markets, other bovine products also rise to the top.
Yeah, that's what's and that's one of the great truths about markets, that whether it was the Japanese market, the real estate market, gold market, there's nothing like a permanent bull market. That's what I have also learned in my career. A piece of advice that your editor gave you: don't get blood on your hands.
Mm-hmm.
Explain that in context to us.
Yes. So in 1992, I became the mutual funds editor at Forbes magazine. And the editor of Forbes then was a great man named Jim Michaels, who actually began as a journalist working in India and was the first Western journalist to report on the assassination of Gandhi. And when he came back to the US, his first job working at Forbes was as the mutual funds editor. So I said to him, do you have any advice for me? You did this job once. And he said, yes, don't get anybody's blood on your hands. And what he meant was that communicating about investments confers responsibility, because other people will read what you write and will act on it. And if you give them good advice, they will get good outcomes. And if you give them bad advice, they will get bad outcomes. And you will have their blood on your hands. And the simple way I've always tried to apply that is I would never recommend an investment that I wouldn't make myself. And I think analysts get into trouble when they put favorable ratings on assets that they themselves would never own. And of course, in the early 2000s, we had several cases in the United States that were investigated of analysts recommending telecoms and internet stocks that they privately told their colleagues were junk, that they touted very aggressively to customers and clients. And I think that is the fundamental error that any analyst or journalist, for that matter, can ever make, which is to recommend to others something you would not do yourself.
You're right. The importance of a fiduciary relationship between the reader and the writer is so very important. The process of integrity, that people trust the written word. Before we go ahead, remember there's a poll in progress, so please put in your votes as we speak with Jason Zweig. Jason, one of your columns that I actually enjoyed, I was sitting in a car and read it, and the paper almost fell out of my hands because it resonated such truths, in which you said that sometimes a haircut can cost $300,000. Please explain that to our audience.
Yes. So this is a wonderful anecdote from the terrific book on Warren Buffett, written by Alice Schroeder, The Snowball, in which she talks about how when Warren was a very young man, he used to say, I don't want to get my hair cut because it'll cost me $300,000. And what he was doing was he was essentially looking at the present cost of the haircut, a few dollars, and then as a discount rate, he was applying the expected return on his investment portfolio over, say, the next 30 to 50 years, and saying, I'm not going to get my haircut because I can take that money, invest it, and compound it for decades to come, and it'll turn into $300,000 in the future. Now, the obvious danger here is that if you forego all pleasures, luxuries, and even some essentials in life today in exchange for reward in the distant future, you probably won't live a very happy and fulfilling life. And deferring all gratification decades into the future is not a recipe for human happiness. And I would not encourage everybody to do it. However, as a way of practicing discipline in your decision-making process, I think it's very helpful. I think if you say, before I spend money on that pair of shoes or
that vacation.
Yes, this vacation, or even within a business itself, before we invest in this particular technology or hire a particular person, are we sure that down the road we won't feel that we could have spent the money better elsewhere? So I wouldn't necessarily practice it as a way of managing my emotional life, but I think it can be an effective tool for filtering financial decisions.
You know, Jason, I got to share this story with you. In the 80s, when I was a young analyst living in America, actually, and I read the work of Jim Rogers and Warren Buffett, and they'd always said, my wife wanted to buy furniture because we were newly married and wanted to populate the house. And I refused to do it. And she said, Ramesh, I can't live in the Dow Jones. I need furniture, I need a sofa, I need a couch. So that principle really resonated with me. And do you feel that most people understand compounding? Do people get it, the importance of compounding and what a difference it makes to your life?
Oh, no, certainly not. In fact, I don't think even most professionals fully appreciate it. Compounding is very non-intuitive. And I honestly think the old days, you go back to the 1980s as I do. I think in the old days when compounding was actually displayed in compound interest tables printed on pieces of paper, it's a shame that we don't spend more time viewing compound interest tables, or at least looking at parabolas in computer displays. The more people can familiarize themselves with the power of compounding, I think the better off they all will be. And I think it's very important for analysts, like all professionals, to recognize that professional training can take you only so far in counteracting the universal limitations of the human mind. And the human mind is not built to easily grasp a concept like compounding, whose power manifests over the course of many, many years and involves sort of numerical manipulation that doesn't come naturally to human cognition. So don't take that for granted, and don't assume that your CFA gives you magical powers. You have to immerse yourself in the numbers as if you have never seen them before to appreciate their power.
Yeah, I'll just share two stats with you, Jason. The first one, of course, is what Einstein said, that compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. And then the more impressive stat is that Warren Buffett, who's worth 60 million, 70 billion, something in north of that, made 90% of that money after he was 65 years old.
Correct.
That
Absolutely.
speaks to the power of compounding, really.
Yep.
So you've got an audience who will probably understand it because they're all CFAs. Let me also remind them that a poll is in progress. So please put in your votes and register your preferences in the poll. Let me just go to some of the questions that our audience has been putting to you. So just give me a second. Let me pull down the questions for you. Mohammed Nazmul says, ethics is the core of investigative journalism. And is it hard to come by?
Well, I don't think so. You know, can ethics be taught? I think, yes, absolutely, but only by example. And surely there are some people who can't be taught to be ethical, or at least haven't been taught to be ethical. Maybe that's the better way to put it. I doubt anyone is born unethical, but some people become that way. Everything I've learned by example. I've learned from my parents. I've learned from my older colleagues. I've learned from my mentors. And, you know, people who take ethics seriously put it above everything else. And, you know, one of the most memorable moments of my career came when I was thinking about leaving Forbes magazine. This was in 1995, and going to work at Time Inc., at Money magazine. And I was concerned that I was going from an environment where there was no doubt that we were meant to serve our readers, that we had to put our audience first, and that, as you alluded to earlier, that I was a fiduciary on behalf of my readers. And I was concerned that I might be going to a place where that wasn't necessarily true. And so I called Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard.
Vanguard.
Yeah. And this is something I have never done before or since, because it's a little strange for a journalist to ask a source for personal advice, but I felt I could make an exception in his case. And I said, I'm struggling with a decision and I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing. And I explained the situation to him, and then he said, so what are you afraid of? And I immediately said, I'm afraid they'll take my integrity away from me. And he said, if they can take your integrity away from you, you never possessed it in the first place. And I immediately hung up the phone and accepted the job, because that put it in perfect perspective for me. And ultimately, that's what ethics means. It means that you have internalized the right thing to do and the right form of conduct. And one simple procedure that I use is, of course, in my job, I'm often asked to participate in outside activities, as I'm doing this evening. And I reject most of those opportunities, and I reject them very quickly. They usually involve, you know, something that could be regarded as promotional for someone's business, which I don't want to be involved in. But the rule I usually follow is, if I have to ask whether it's wrong, then it's wrong, and I don't need to ask.
Right. Jason, one question coming in my own interpretation to it. Has the world of investing changed permanently due to COVID-19? And in COVID-19 times, when you can't visit people and can't talk to them face to face, how do you use your judgment?
Oh, those are two Well, let's separate those.
Okay.
The answer to the first is no. It can't have permanently changed investing. I think, look, some industries may be permanently impaired, and we're all just guessing. You know, if I had to guess, I would say, you know, the cinema as a public forum may be permanently changed. I think people will continue to watch movies and they'll watch more video than ever, probably, but I don't know if we'll be gathering in cinemas with hundreds of other people sitting in close proximity, at least in the near future. I think that's highly unlikely. But I don't think it will make broad, fundamental, permanent changes. I think hygiene will improve around the world. I think people will wash their hands a lot more. They'll probably shake hands a little less.
Namaste. Indian greeting.
That's right. Yes, and I am in favor of that. Thank you. That's a very good suggestion. But as for research, of course, it has changed. You know, everything or almost everything that we do at the Wall Street Journal now, we do remotely. People still go out in the field. I have reporting colleagues who are traveling and who are meeting with people in person. But of course, obviously, they're wearing masks and they're being extremely careful and staying 2 meters apart and doing all of the requirements. But I think in the next few years, we'll come back to more normal ways of interacting with each other. And then we'll be visiting companies, we'll be meeting people in person as we always have. It's still possible to do extremely good research and investigation using the phone. I mean, I've done several significant investigations this year, and I think I did them all
On the phone.
After February on the phone,
Okay.
without meeting anyone in person.
Jason, an analyst who wants to remain anonymous asks you this question. Has the Wall Street Journal upper management ever signaled that you should desist or stop with an investigation? What would be your reaction?
No, that's never happened. And to the best of my knowledge, that does not happen at the Journal. And the single best example I can give you of that, we already discussed, and that's the Theranos investigation that my colleague John Carreyrou did. The family of Rupert Murdoch had invested $120 million in Theranos. And even for Rupert Murdoch, $120 million is not a small amount of money. That was a major part of his portfolio, at least I assume. $120 million is a lot of money, even for Mr. Murdoch. He was an investor in the company, and at no point in the process did he interfere at all. I've never had any senior management get involved in anything I've written for any reason. If that were to happen, that would be, well, first of all, it would come as a great surprise. And secondly, I would certainly make an issue of it. And I assume typically in those cases at other news organizations, other good news organizations, the reporter will often prevail. Not always, but at the Journal, I am unaware that that's ever happened. It certainly never happened to me.
I understand. You would use the Bogle test. I mean, if you felt you had to listen to them, you'd probably resign. Because ethics is where it starts, as you said.
Yeah,
you already answered this question in your talk, but maybe you'll give some more color to it. You said you start from the back and go to the front when reading an annual report. You look at the footnotes and the chairman's speech last. So the question is from Vijay Kumar. He says, any specific area you pay more attention to in an annual report as an investigative journalist? So is it the footnotes?
Yeah, so I literally do start at the back. And of course, how I read depends on which financial document I'm reading. So let's say I'm reading the proxy statement. I will look at the compensation. Typically, I'll look at the compensation. I'll look at the conflicts of interest. I'm looking for red flags. I'm looking for things that can signal problems within the company. And an expression that I like, that I heard when I was a very young reporter, is all problems wear shoes, which essentially means that all problems are caused by people. So you're looking for, what are you looking for? You're looking for conflicts of interest. You're looking for insider dealing of some kind. You're looking for improper, incomplete, inadequate, confusing disclosure. So any change in accounting treatment is extremely important. Companies can change how they account for things for very good reasons. They also can change for bad reasons. The other thing I would always recommend, and I think this is fairly obvious, but I'll mention it just in case, and that is that if you suspect something is wrong at a company, then you should read its accounts alongside its competitors' accounts. And sometimes turning page by page, several documents at once, because at least in the US, and I'm sure it's true in India as well, they tend to be formatted very similarly with the same section headings and the same breaks in subject matter. The footnotes tend to signify the same content. So you can read footnote 9 in every annual report within an industry. And that way you may see that company A is saying things in footnote 9 that no other company in its industry is saying. Now, today, you can do much of this using, third-party data providers. In the US, I would use InFilings or MyLogic or other third-party providers. You might use Bloomberg or FactSet, but this kind of textual analysis is easy to do electronically. It also can be satisfying to do manually because you may pick up things almost tangibly by using your fingers and your eyes that you might miss if you're using a computer.
Great. We've talked a lot about movies, so there's a question on movies here from a gentleman called Carlos Felipe. He says, listening to Jason, I can't help but remember the movie The State of Play with Ben Affleck and Russell Crowe. Would you say that the movie pretty much displays what you've talked about today? I haven't seen the movie, but have you seen it?
I'm afraid I have not seen that movie, but
okay.
you're making me want to watch it. So
okay, great. So we give you you give us a stock recommendation, we'll give you a movie recommendation. State of Play. Let's see. Ramji Porwal asks a question. He says, sometimes there's a window of opportunity where you need to make a balance between analysis and action. Sometimes the more analysis you do, the price moves up or the less action you take. How do you balance between analysis and action when you pick a stock?
Boy, that's a very good question. I mean, I think, so I'm going to leave my investigative journalist hat aside to answer this question, I think really what it points to is the importance of having a decision-making structure, particularly working from a watch list. And if you have a watch list of, I mean, I don't know how your firm operates, but maybe you have a watch list of 20 companies you don't own, but that you would like to own at the right price, at the right moment. Then, you know, part of every work week should be devoted to updating that watch list and doing any necessary research, uploading additional data, maybe making some calls, speaking to management or competitors or suppliers or customers. And if you have your watch list ready, you can avoid some of the, I guess I would say, last minute panic if the price moves toward your favor. If the price moves into the zone at which you feel you have to make a decision, if you've been maintaining the watch list and keeping it current, then the price should give you the decision point because your watch list already has you informed about the opportunity.
Jason, I'll do a rapid fire round with you. That'll be fun. We'll get you short answers. But before that, let me ask you, is regression to mean one of the great truths about financial markets?
Yes, of course it is. Although I think there are quite a few pitfalls. The first is that the mean does not regress on your calendar. It regresses on its own calendar, which is known to no one. If you're a value investor, you know exactly what I mean.
I do.
Value investing has been out of favor in the US and I believe globally for well over a decade at this point. And I personally believe it will come back into favor. It will regress to the mean, but I've given up trying to predict when that will be. I don't know if it has already happened, it's already underway, or whether it will be another decade or more.
I have to quote Jason Keynes for you. I'm sure you read the quote by Keynes, that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So regression to mean has its own time.
Yeah, it can take an unconscionably long time. And then the second factor that I think is underappreciated is the mean is always in flux. So the mean is constantly changing. The mean itself is not a constant. So think about, for example, what happens if we're looking at 10-year returns. What happens in 2019? Well, the 10-year returns no longer include the global financial crisis, and the mean return suddenly jumps upward because the bad returns at the beginning of the measurement period have disappeared because we're now over 10 years past the period. And so the mean itself is always in flux. And that, I think, is underappreciated by almost everyone who participates in the markets. And when you say that the market will regress to the mean, you have to bear in mind that the mean itself is changing. Just being humble about that, I think, can help us all, because you don't want to be cocky and overconfident about regression to the mean. It's not, I mean, I regard it as a law of financial physics, but it's kind of a weak law because the constant is not a constant in the sense that physics has constants. It's a variable.
You know, I think Mark Twain, one of your favorite authors, said about this also. He said there are three kinds of lies in the world: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Because depending on the mean flux, they can change the outcomes pretty dramatically. He said a man drowned in a pool 3 feet deep because he didn't know it was 12 feet at some point. That's good.
Yes.
Jason, I'm really excited to do a quick rapid fire round with you in the few minutes remaining. Are you ready for that? Okay.
Well, I think so. We'll find out.
Ready or not, right?
Yeah.
If you could spend an hour with either Buffett or Munger, who would you choose?
At this point, Buffett, because I've spent a fair amount of time with Munger over the past few years.
Okay. The greatest entrepreneur over the last 50 years, Elon Musk or Steve Jobs?
Jeff Bezos.
Really? Okay. Over the next 5 years, would you invest in gold or Bitcoin?
Neither.
Okay. Over the next 5 years, would you favor Tesla or Zoom or Amazon?
I'm going to say Amazon.
All right. You predicated your view by picking Jeff Bezos, so that's good.
Yeah.
Fair enough. If I gave you a choice to have dinner with any three financial personalities, living or dead, who would you pick?
Definitely Benjamin Graham. I'm going to say Buffett because I've had dinner with Munger. And a man named Floyd Odlum, who was the greatest value investor in the US in the Great Depression.
Repeat that name. We've not heard of him here. So
No, people don't know who he is in the US either. Floyd Odlum, spelled
Okay.
F-L-O-Y-D-O-D-L-U-M. One of these days I'll write about him, I think.
hopefully not Floyd George, but Floyd Adlam. Okay, thanks. That's good. We'd love to hear about that. Between globalization, which had been the current wind, to nationalism, which is the current wind, the previous wind and the current wind, what do you think will prevail over the next 5 years in the world? More globalization or more nationalism?
I hope it will be globalism. I fear it will be nationalism.
Could be nationalism. Good point. You're fond of investigative journalism, uncovering frauds. Who was the greatest sinner? Was it Bernie Madoff or was it Kenneth Lay of Enron?
I would have to say Madoff, because I think there was, that just feels right. I don't know how else to answer that.
Okay. We want to know about US elections. So do you think Trump will run for re-election in 2024? Yes or no?
Oh, I don't think my editors would want me to answer that question.
Okay.
So I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay, fair enough. My last rapid round question for you. Given the movement towards clean energy, electric cars, what will the price of oil be 10 years from now? Will it be above $40 or below $40?
I would guess it would be below.
Below 40?
I think so.
Okay. You know, Jason, I know you're a student of the Middle East culture. You studied in Jerusalem. So to end this session, I will quote from you from a Middle Eastern proverb which says, keep your gold, keep your silver, but give me your wisdom, which is exactly what you've done for the last 2 hours, shared with us your enormous wisdom, culled from almost 25 years of writing and watching financial markets. We can't thank you enough for being our guest today.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
Namaste. Thank you.
Yes.
In closing, I just have a few comments to make. The poll is still open, so please fill in the poll. And as a reminder to our listeners, please complete the evaluation poll. And the CFA Society reminds you that you may claim professional learning credit by logging into the online professional learning tracking tool. Thank you all so much for participating in this wonderful seminar. Thank you, Jason, for being our guest today.
Thank you, Ramesh ji.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason ji. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.